is Emanuele, like Daniela said, and so I work as a character animator for a big part of my career. First in the visual effects industry on movies like Harry Potter, The Chronicles of Narnia, and other movies like where I was animating mainly creatures and realistic stuff like that. And then I came to the States and I started working at Blue Sky Studios, again as a character animator, working on movies like Ice Age, Rio, Ferdinand, recently Spies in Disguise, and movies like that. And then I wanted to transition into design and into visual development. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially when people start seeing you as a certain type, and so if people think of you as an animator, they just think that that's the only thing you can do. So it's a little bit hard to show that you can do that. And finally, director Mark Osborne is the director for who is not familiar with him, of Kung Fu Panda, The Little Prince. He was developing some movies at Netflix Animation, and he called me to start working in VR, to basically create environments for his movies very early on in the process, because usually in 3D animation it takes a long time with the traditional pipeline to see what you're doing. And so Mark wanted to see that early, and he called me in, him and also Lip Comarella, which maybe is another artist that you're maybe familiar with. And so that I worked there for a couple of years, and then recently I just joined a new studio. It's called Spire Animation Studios. It's a new startup that is based here in California. I live in California now, and it's a very exciting new startup because we are developing an animated feature film that will be entirely rendered in real time using the Unreal Engine, and we're partnering with Epic in order to do that. And so it feels very new, very fresh. And I just started it, so I'm liking it so far. But what I wanted to talk to you today, though, is not my my work for the animation industry, but more my personal work, which is something that it's very important for me, and I use it to develop my own style and to try new techniques, new softwares, and as I'm sure it's the same for a bunch of you artists. It's an addiction. I have to do it, right? So, all right. So let me start sharing my screen. All right. So let me spoil the end. What I'm gonna show today, I'm gonna demonstrate. So we're gonna create this image that is part of my series that I call the Nude Polis, and it's all modeled in Gravity Sketch, and then it's shaded and rendered using blenders. And I'm gonna show you how I created this image, but let's take a step back, and I want to show you also how I planned this image first. So I start from a 2D sketch, but not just a normal 2D sketch. I do a pixel art style sketch. Oh, you don't see anything? I see someone in the top. Okay, we see. Vedo tutto. Okay, there's some Italian as well. All right. Thank you, guys. Okay, great. So, like I was saying, instead of doing a pencil art, I started doing these pixelated sketches, and I started doing that when I was still in Blue Sky Studios. We had a live drawing session with a model, and every week. And at some point, I got a little bored of doing pencil sketches. I wanted to try something different. So I grabbed my Surface tablet, and using a software called Sprite, I started doing live drawing with the model using pixel art. And the result felt very fresh to me. So I started doing this series, and I called them the Nude Pixels. So then the next step was to take these, and I was curious to see how would they look in 3D? So I started doing another series that I called the nude polys, like I said. And so this is how I translate them. And they're both very stylized. And I like that when I draw in with pixels, I just have a bunch of pixels to create an image. And so I can get lost into details. I have to, just think of the overall shapes, and it helps me really to push the design language. And so I try to maintain that in 3D. And so if the nude pixels sort of reference the 8-bit video games, the nude polys reference a little bit more the sort of early 2000, early 3D games. Things like, Final Fantasy VII or, the early Tomb Raider and things like that. Sometimes I like to go a little bit more sculptural with the type of render. But as you can see, I always maintain the pose, even if I change maybe the palette. And so I use that as a starting point to start with. And so here are some of the references on what I mentioned, like what I'm thinking about when I do this type of paintings. And so, like early 3D video games like Final Fantasy VII. I don't know if you were around when this came out. They were, pretty amazing at the time. And then also another thing that I noticed when I was starting painting that is that they started to feel a little bit like cubist. So I kind of embraced that and wanted to sort of push that aspect a little bit. And so in the one that I'm doing today, I was paying attention, for example, in painting like the Demoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso. It's one of my favorite paintings. How Picasso was interpreting the background and folding it, and I was thinking, how can I do that in 3D? How can I translate it in a way that is similar to what I do? See in the comments, virtual fight. Yeah, that's right. And also I'm looking at sculptures like Isamu Noguchi, for example, that create these very simple sculptures that feel very low poly, right? But then there's an appreciation for the materials that he uses. And yes, so, all right, so why don't we jump into Gravity Sketch? And I'm gonna play a video. And all right, so one of the first, and here, like, maybe the first technical tip that I wanna give you guys is when you work in 3D to always work at scale. And one way, quick, easy way to do that in Gravity Sketch is to grab the model that comes with Gravity Sketch and drop it into the green box. And if you do so, it's going to appear in the scene measuring 1 meter and 70 centimeters. And so you know that when you export your model back and forth from Gravity Sketch to Blender or Maya, whatever you want to use, you know that the model will be the right size, because you don't want to create something that is tiny in VR or gigantic. It's better to keep it in scale. It's easy to go back and forth, so something that I would recommend. And then, I just created my model like that, and I'm just gonna place it there in the background to have it as a reference for the size. And then for this type of modeling, this low poly modeling that I'm doing, I'm just gonna use basically the one tool, which is the subdivision cube, and I'm gonna set it so that it's in low poly mode, so that the polygons don't get smoothed out, they stay visible. And then I start, push and pulling CVs and start creating the main shapes of the figure. And at this stage, I'm not refining things too much. I just wanna stay rough a little bit. I mean, it's a type of modeling that I'm not gonna, of course, go into too much details even at the end, but I just I want to arrive fast at the final sculpture so that I can then tweak everything and see how it works. Because even if I have like a 2D image, there are a lot of things that I'm figuring out in 3D. And so here, for example, I'm modeling the torso, and something that I like to do is to use those polygon lines to refer to the anatomy a little bit. So I'm twisting the torso a little bit, like I'm imagining this model would be posed. And posing is something that's very important for me. It's something that comes from character animation, my character animation background, where posing is one of the main things that you do as an animator, actually. And so even if the sculpt is very simple, the pose has to be convincing and more sophisticated. And so here, yeah, I keep adding pieces until I have the whole model completed. And doing a low poly head, and yeah, it's interesting that this technique of modeling is very similar to what it was done back in the days, like the typical box modeling that you were doing by splitting and extruding polygons. But in VR, it's so easy to do that because you can just grab something and positioning it. So even if it's similar to an old technique, it's just so fast to do that in VR. I see someone asking about what do I use for pixel art. I use a software called Sprite. It's a very cheap software and it's great. I recommend it. I recommend trying it on. And so here, again, I'm sculpting the face a little bit, and I'm keeping it very simple and almost like if I'm drawing on top of the surface. But I want to create, though, a nice expression. And I'm pretty much drawing with the polygons right here. And I want there to have like sort of like a badass expression, fierce and bold. Giving her some earrings, and then start to add some hair. And I'm adding some colors here, but they're not the final colors. Those will be added later in Blender, but it's good to have something as a reference here just to see if the model is working. And here I'm using the curve tool just for a change. I love the curve tool in Gravity Sketch. It's so versatile, but it just wasn't, the right tool for this type of sculpt. So yeah, everything, depending on the styles, there are some tools that are more appropriate than others. Here I'm figuring out like a cool hairstyle. And always turn around your sculpt to see if it works from every angle, even if my final output will be a 2D image. I still want to be sure that it's gonna work all around. And then again, I'm using the curve tool here to do some individual strands of hair. And but I want to keep it a little jagged to be more in style. But if you see also with the hair and the big, the main chunk of hair is also twisted so that there's that dynamic element as well that is added. Posing the hand and doing the index and for fingers separated is a good way to stylize a hand. So it's something that it's done in illustration often as well. And so then once I have everything down, I can just start adjusting those CVs, pushing and pulling until I'm happy with it. And that's pretty much it. So in the end, I save it and export it as an OBJ, leaving pretty much the default options. And so that concludes the modeling part in Gravity Sketch. And so let's jump into Blender now. Here we go. And so I also sculpted a little background that I don't have a time lapse for. But the first thing that I recommend doing if you jump into Blender, so the first thing you notice when you jump into Blender is that it comes in as as a big mesh combined and with all the materials there. So what you want to separate this mesh into single objects. But before doing that, you want to remove all those extra materials, because otherwise each and every single material will have 100 materials there. So the way to do that is just to go into your shader editors, in edit mode, I want to assign a single material to everything, so that then if I go back to the object mode, now the material is still there, but I can now remove the unused slot like that, and now I'm going to have a cleaner scene to work with. And then another thing that I'm going to do is clean up, and I'm going to do merge by distance, and this will eliminate a lot of CVs that are not needed. And then I can separate all the objects, and now I have the individual pieces that I can work with. So that's just something to set up your scene that I think, it could be useful for you guys if you want to play around with Blender. And so then I'm starting to organize the scene a little bit, and I'm gonna put the figure in one collection, and then the background in another collection, just so that I can, have a clean outliner. And then I'm gonna start adding materials. And first, before jumping into colors and into the image that you saw at the end, I want to do a black and white version, just to play around with materials and with the cameras, and to have a feeling for the composition. So I'm creating a bunch of different gray materials from white to black, and assigning to the different elements in order to have a black and white image, without textures, without anything, just with simple materials of a color. And here another tip for who's learning Blender: if you want to assign a material to multiple objects, you can just select a bunch of objects, and then Control L is your friend. You hit Control L and click on Link Materials, and then materials will be assigned to all the other objects. So that's what I'm using a lot here. Control L, Control L, Control L, and just giving name to my materials to keep it tidy. And so, yeah, I'm creating this black and white image. Now I'm starting to set a camera, and so I'm gonna start with a 35mm focal length, so to have like a sort of like a standard image, but then I want to try a bunch of different lenses to see what I like, and I'm also looking for a composition. So and here I'm setting the resolution in a way that it's gonna match the canvas, because I want to make a painting out of it afterwards. So that's why I'm using this more squarish aspect ratio. And so finding my composition with the 35, and what I was seeing here is that the ground was taking a lot of space. So now I'm trying other lenses, and now as you can see, I duplicated the camera and changed it to a 50mm, and now I'm going longer and longer with the camera lenses. Now I'm going to a 70mm, and seeing how that affects the relation between the character and the background. And as you can see, by increasing the focal length, and here I'm going to stop a second, by increasing the focal length, the background gets compressed. And a great add-on in order to do that is this add-on that is called Photographer. And I'm going to use this feature called Dolly Zoom, where you can pin a point in your composition, and the add-on will keep that point anchored there and change the focal length, basically moving the camera back to compensate in the field of view change. So as you can see, that's the effect that you see. And so you can easily switch between 70 to 180mm, 35, 50, and see what feels better. And I was realizing that the longer lenses were feeling better. So I kept going, and now I'm trying it to 100mm lens, as you can see with Photographer. You can see that distortion happening in the background. And yeah, so I started with a 35 and then decided to go all the way up to 200 millimeters. And here you can see in 3D like what photographer does. First, what I was doing manually, and then automatically with photographer, it pulls back the camera so that the composition stays the same, but changes the focal length. So changing the relationship between the foreground and the background. And now I'm starting to play with the lights, and I love that in Blender with the Eevee render engine that works in real time, you can really iterate a lot. You can just test stuff and see what you like. And here, so I started with an area light that gives you more softer shadows. And then I started to see actually, oh, what if I use a point light actually? And you can just play around with positioning the light. And here I didn't have an idea in mind of where I wanted to go. I just wanted to experiment. And I think it's great that nowadays you can experiment in 3D so much, because it wasn't that easy, back in the days when a render was taking half an hour or so. Here I was adding like a rim light, see how that feel. Maybe it was making the image feeling a little bit too complicated, so I got rid of that. And now I'm trying to add like a spotlight just on her face to make the face pop a little bit more, since that's where we want to look at, right? So then I was using the custom distance feature of Blender so that you can have the light not hit the background. It's just the fall off is gonna stop, so that it's just gonna stop at the face and it's not gonna reach the background. And then I'm gonna soften these lights using the blend feature. And finally, I'm gonna add some depth of field. Again, using the Blender add-on, you can visualize the point in focus, and that adds a little bit of a cinematic feeling to it. And that's pretty much my final image, my final black and white image. And so once I'm done, I'm gonna now send it to my 3D printer here, and there you go, guys. In my little thumbnails, the painted image. You have to see in my camera, by the way. I always like to do an oil painting out of my renders, so there is it. And then now, okay, it's so this was the first step, and now we have a second step where I go into color, and let's jump into that. So for the color part, I decided to change the composition, and I wanted to get wider to see a little bit more of that background. And here I'm adding textures, and the way I add texture is a very sort of, again, iterative way and very procedural, in the sense that I don't do any UV. I don't do any UV mapping. I'm just, in this case, for example, I'm just painting some, I just painted in Photoshop a brushstroke sort of texture, like some black and white brushstrokes. And then I'm placing it in Blender directly on the materials using the a feature of Blender is called generated UVs that automatically generate some UVs for you. And then I'm recoloring this texture directly in the scene, and so that I can reuse that on the different materials, and I can just change color on the fly in Blender. And here again, I'm starting to play with some light. Again, very, in a very playful way. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I know that I want to do something very colorful, because my first two previous paintings were black and white, so I wanted to go a little crazy. And here, what I'm showing you here is another Blender add-on that leverages the new asset browser by Blender, by the way. And it's called Polyhaven. And here, what you see here are a bunch of HDR lighting scenarios that I can just drag. And you're going to see now that I'm going to quickly drag this HDR into the scene to find there you go, like to find lighting that I like as a starting point. And then the HDR comes with a background, but you can turn it off. And so I'm using that as a starting point because I wanted to have more of a daylight scene as opposed to that black and white one. here I'm creating a dome, half a dome that I'm using it as a sky texture, and I'm going to assign an emissive material, meaning that it's going to actually illuminate the scene as well. It's not just going to be there in the background. And then once I have all these elements down, well, here I'm creating a gradient for the sky so that there's a little bit of gradation back there. And again, I can just, thanks to Eevee's real-time capabilities, I can just iterate and try different gradients. Do I want something more realistic, or do I want to push it, make it yellow, and then I settle for this sort of teal sky. And now that I locked my camera pretty much and my composition, I want to change that background to make it more pleasant. So I start thinking a little bit in a 2D way. I start to push and pull around these CVs, rearrange those boulders a little bit, and to avoid, like some tangencies that are a little bit ugly and not very pleasant to the eye. And I start creating a nicer composition, basically. That's all I'm doing. So working on the composition, on the shapes, to make it as nice as possible, create a nice rhythm with it. And there, those boulders behind, to me, they look a little bit like two mountains in the distance. I always like, often in my painting, to create like an opening so that there's depth there. And then playing around with the colors of the hair in this case. And as you can see, everything pretty much is a sort of like a painterly texture, but it's not painted directly on each material with the UVs. It's just, done like in a very rough way. Oh, and here is another cool thing that you can do with Blender using the 3D cursor. That is that this thing here. You can basically create a rig without having a rig. So you can, for example, rotate the whole arm or the forearm of the character without having rigged. So it's a very powerful tool. So I could adjust the pose a little bit for the camera. And again, here I'm pushing the lighting. And I like to think that I'm sort of painting with the light. For example, I wanted some bright yellow on the right and something in orange on the left. And here I'm adding a little bit of subsurface scattering on the skin to soften a little bit those geometry. The subsurface kind of created a waxy effect. So by adding it to the girl, it's gonna sort of soften that poly effect just a little bit. And here I'm adding some variations on the color texture of these boulders, and I'm using the ambient occlusion node. As you can see, that usually it will reveal where the shadow is, but I'm using it to basically isolate an area where I can place another texture to add some more variety to that texture. So here, as you can see, I'm adding this sort of spatter splotches texture, and I'm recoloring with another color, again iterating and see what I like, so that I have variations all around. I don't create a more rich and interesting texture, and then I can layer everything on top of each other with the mix RGB node. That it's a bit like your layers in Photoshop, pretty much. You can have two different textures, two different branches, and mix them together. And yeah, here I wanted to assign another color to that part under her hair to add a bit more contrast there. And here again, I'm using the ambient occlusion node to isolate the edges of this boulder in this case. And that's something that people usually do. Like if you do something more realistic, if you want to add some edge wear, for example, to the edges, you can use a technique like that. But in this case, I just want to add a color variation. So now I'm isolating that edges to find that area. And then once I have it, I can use it to blend another color into it. You can see now that it's taking shape. I can now add that sort of darker pink there. It makes that whole material look a little bit more interesting. And then now I'm keep going with the texturing and with the shading. I'm adding something to the roughness so that if you see the material at an angle with the light, it's gonna glitter a little bit. It's gonna have a different, slightly different behavior. And you can see here that sort of reflection that takes the shape of this spatter texture. And so all this layering sort of add complexity to the shape. But I want to keep it subtle though. Now I'm adding also a little bit of bump that I'm using again a painterly texture, and so the bump is adding a little bit of almost like if you see some extra brush strokes there, and it's hard to see now with the video, but I'm gonna show you later from the Blender file those individual passes, how they look like. And then now I'm ready to kick off the final render, and finally I'm importing it into Photoshop for a final color correction. And then I'm adding a little bit of noise to add some grain to the image at the end, so to warm it up a little bit, make it feel less digital, and unsharp mask to make it pop a little bit more. And then some local adjustment in the end, like I felt like those hair were mixing a little bit with the background too much, so I darkened them a little bit. And so that's the final image. And let me show you quickly Blender, just what I meant with those different texture layers. And by the way, I mean, like I said earlier, I love that I can just have my 3D scene render here. I can just rotate it around and see it in real time, change the composition if I want. But for example, let's take this boulder, and so you can see here all this layering. For example, these lines here, that's the texture on the bump that creates this. And then here you can see, if I rotate the camera, you can see that these spatter textures start to come out, and that's what I put on the roughness. And here you can see that edge wear sort of texture on the edges. You can see another texture here along the occlusion, and so on and so forth. So there's all this layering that can be done directly into Blender, into the viewport. And yeah, just to finish, this approach is something that, someone that works in production might say, well, the texture doesn't really hold up to a close-up, but I work more as a visual development, with a visual development artist mentality, so that as long as it works from the viewport and as long as it gives the idea, it's fine by me. It doesn't have to be seen in a close-up or things like that. And then I want to close with a quote that I really like, that I bumped into this year and kind of resonated with me, from art critic Jerry Saltz, that says, "Artists, you do know, don't you, that your mistakes are your style?" And I want to leave you with that. I don't know, it really resonated with me. And yeah, okay, I think this is my talk. And Daniela, if you want to jump back in.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much for this. This was beautiful to see the development of.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you. Appreciate it.
And
hopefully it wasn't too fast, or I don't know. It's hard to pace yourself, but
no, it was perfect. I think, if people are rewatching it, they're probably going to pause it and try to see what are the kind of like little things that you're tweaking.
Yes.
We had a lot of comments on, people wanting to get into Blender because of this demonstration. So
I'm glad. I recommend it. Yeah, Blender is so much fun. It's such a great software.
All right. So I'll start with the questions from the audience, and then I'll jump into mine. Can you show anything from the designs you did from Narnia and Ice Age, etc.?
Well, that's I can show. I was doing mainly animation from. Let me see. Okay, let me see if I can find something. Yeah, I think I can show you something. it's animation, like I said, but give me 1 second. Find it. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna show you something from Ice Age 5. Okay. Wait. I have to share the screen again, right? Audience screen. Okay, so this is some exploration for Ice Age 5. It's probably gonna play a little, jagged, but the frame rate it's probably not gonna be great, I imagine. But these are all scenes that I animated on the movie. This is not prepared, so I just grab a video from my hard disk to show you guys. But yeah, this was a very fun. And animating Scrat especially was like a dream come true for me. It was because it's such a fun character to animate, very difficult, but these were tests that we were doing throughout the movie for some effects that were happening. And so yeah, this is 2015. You see the date here. Wow, it's 7 years ago. Crazy. And this is similar to what I show you, but already. I want to show you another scene, but it's not here. But anyway, you get the idea pretty much.
This is amazing. It's really cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
To be seeing it from your computer, the guy that actually.
Yeah, this wasn't prepared, so I just grabbed file really quick.
All right. So another question is, while coloring in Blender, how do you add the yellow gradient to the tips of the hair?
Right. You can add a gradient in Blender. There's a gradient texture, and you can mix it with the Mix RGB node, and you can position it. I can maybe quickly share the screen again, and let's see. So if we go into the shading tab, and I was thinking, but basically, yeah, you can layer things in Blender, right? With the Mix RGB node, like the node that I mentioned earlier, is like your best friend if you're doing texturing. So let's see if I remember what I did. Yeah, so I have a base layer with the texture. So this is my painterly brush strokes. Let's zoom in a little bit closer. Is my painterly brush stroke that it's almost not visible, but so that it's not just a gradient. There is a little bit of grain and things. And yeah, in the thumbnail, you can see what it does. And then on a separate branch, I have this gradient here, gradient texture, that I can position with a color ramp node, and then I can color with a Mix RGB node here. And then this Mix RGB node, I feed it into the main Mix RGB node from this chain. And so what the Mix RGB nodes does basically is to say, okay, all this is the layer on top, and all this is the layer below. And here you can change how to mix this layer. You have all these different mixing types that is like Photoshop, like the blending layers in Photoshop. So you can, for example, multiply, subtract, color burn, etc. And then you plug it into the base color, and that's how you get the ramp. So here I can dynamically change the color. For example, if I go here and I change to pink, then the tip of the color changes to pink. And if I change this to, I can, change that dynamically. So it's a little bit tricky, but hopefully you can, if you want to, take a screenshot of the screen, for example, then it's easy to replicate once you have that, that node structure. It's actually not that complicated to do.
How do you usually animate the characters' facial expressions?
Yeah, facial expression is a whole world basically. It's something that actually when I was working in visual effects first, there was more creature and things like that. it was all about weight and, giving the sense of weight of imagine like a dragon landing or something like that. And then when I move into animated feature in Blue Sky, suddenly you have these big heads with big eyes, big mouth, and so you have to pay a lot of attention to the facial animation. And I mean, there's a lot to say about it, but let's just say that a good thing is to think in terms of 2D illustration. If you pay attention, for example, to comics or to illustrations, the way they draw the face is always very appealing. There are some techniques that comic artists usually use, and we try to do something similar in 3D. So there's a lot of times spent posing the shape and the face and making sure that all the facial elements are work in, sort of in relation with each other in a sort of cohesive way. And then, of course, we can talk about timing and all that, but it's a big topic, yeah. But another thing that I would recommend, though, is to film yourself, act it out, film yourself, and just try to match it in 3D.
Do you do that?
Oh yeah, all the time. That's what animators do all the time, shooting references, being like clowns basically, and yeah.
I love that. Mm-hmm. How does your texturing work hold up to 360-degree panorama views?
Do you mean if I spin around the model? I guess it holds up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it holds up. It's not perfect in the sense that, like I said, I often don't use UVs. So in some cases, it may break. So you may see maybe a seam or something, but it holds up usually to a 360. And if I really need something to be specific, then I would do the UVs and just have a more, specific set of textures.
You'll just do it, because that's one of the things that I was kind of like thinking while we were watching your workflow, and obviously all of the examples that you gave. You're working in 3D, but ultimately your brain is always thinking through this 2D image, right?
Yeah.
Like this kind of like clip that you want to show.
That's right. Yes. So ultimately, especially if I want to do a 2D image, as long as it looks good in 2D, I'm fine. And usually it holds up even if I want to do like a little camera movement or a little animation. As long as I don't change too drastically the pose, it holds up fine. Of course, it will be different if I had to do with this character. For example, if I had to do a short or if it was a character for a feature film, then it would be a different story. It would have to be way more detailed. But yeah, for exploring something, that's more than enough. And it's not, it wouldn't make sense to do more than this, because it would be not feasible. And so I would just be wasting my time, basically.
Yeah, I really like that, because then in a way you can go into 3D without necessarily having to go through all of the kind of like craziness and depth always, like sometimes we think that we need to go full in and like correct UVs and like all these sort of things, and sometimes it's not necessary.
Absolutely. It's very liberating, actually, because if you start thinking, I'm going to do this model, but it's the bevels are not perfect, the UVs are not there, but who cares? Ultimately, you're just doing something that is an image on the screen. So as long as it looks okay, you're fine. And yeah.
Yeah. What is your computer setup?
Oh, my computer setup, it's in need of an upgrade, actually, but I would just say that Blender is really power hungry. So especially if you do a scene with a lot of, like this one, with a lot of procedural textures and a lot of different elements, the more power you have, the better. So what I have now is it's a few years old, and I was waiting now for the new graphic cards to come out to upgrade. So, but for example, in Netflix, we were using the graphic card is probably the most important element of your computer. So at Netflix, we were using a 3080 and it was working perfectly. Even if you have a 2080 older, you can still work. But if you can afford something newer, like the new 4090, then you're going to see the benefit. And then, of course, the CPUs is also important. And for certain tasks, because like when, for example, when Eevee compiled the scene, that's all CPUs, so you need good CPUs as well. And then RAM as well, you need as well. I would recommend like 60 megabyte of RAM or more if you can afford it. So yeah, the more the better.
All right, so start saving, people, because
Yeah.
Hey, Emmanuel, how do VR tools open up 3D design possibilities to you? What becomes easy that used to be very difficult? Does it afford more
Ah.
abstraction in 3D design for you?
Oh yes, that too was huge for me, because especially like I said, I transitioned from character animation to environments basically, and also I transitioned from Maya to Blender. So at first I didn't know much about it, and thanks to softwares like Gravity Sketch, I could, with a very quick learning curve at the time. Like I said, it was Lip Comarella that introduced me first to Gravity Sketch, and I could just keep going, and the learning curve was minimized. I would totally recommend to anyone starting to do 3D to start in VR, because it's so much easier. It's like drawing in 3D. You can learn Gravity Sketch in a day or in half a day, and maybe a little bit more than that, but in a day you can definitely have something going. So yes, it helped immensely, for sure.
All right, so we have two more questions. What are the advantages of using Blender over another 3D software?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I mean, all 3D softwares can do great things. Maya can do great things. Houdini, Cinema 4D. I love Blender because I love the philosophy behind Blender. It's an open source software. You don't have to pay a dime for it. And unlike Maya, that it's an old software, it's pretty, I think, around 25 years old. So it's a little bit like, it was awesome when it came out. It was amazing. But then, over the years, they couldn't upgrade the whole software as much. So now it shows his age a little bit. Whereas Blender, it's been totally redesigned a couple years ago, and they are developing very actively. So every 3 months, there's a new release with some amazing new features. Like just recently, they added the geometry nodes so that you can model procedurally, and it's amazing. They just redid the render engine with Cycle X, and everything they do, they say openly what it is, unlike other corporation like Autodesk, that of course everything is behind closed door. And the community is very vibrant. So if you don't know something, you just look it up on YouTube, and there's probably a video of someone explaining it to you. And not only the learning community, but also the teaching learning community, but also the community of that develop add-ons for Blender. A lot of the things that I showed today, like Polyhaven or Photographer. There's Jama, for example, that I was talking yesterday, Jama Jurabayev, that he also makes with his buddy Alexander some amazing add-ons for Blender called the Quick Tools. There's Quick Shape, Quick Draw, Quick Deform, and they are amazing tools. And they just make them and sell them for maybe $20 or something like that, and everyone can use them. So yeah, that's why I use Blender.
Yeah, great tool. Like very, very complete. Okay, so this last one, another curious one about your experience with the movies. How was your experience doing Rio 2?
Rio 2, how was the experience Rio 2? Yeah, Rio 2 was right after that we finished Epic, and I was brought in to work on Epic because Epic had a little bit more of a realistic vibe, and I was coming from visual effects, so I was comfortable doing that. Then Rio suddenly has a very stylized animation style, so for me that was a learning curve. I had to really sort of push my limits and get out of my comfort zone, because if you animate more realistically, your poses are not going to be as pushed, your timing is not going to be as pushed. Whereas if you want to do something like Rio 2, you have this zippy transitions of the characters moving around fast. It has a more sort of pose-to-pose feel, so a character move quickly with a nice, trajectory, so to speak, into the next pose and hit it, and then next pose has to be appealing like an illustration, pretty much. And then think of these birds sort of moving into like one pose and then kind of zipping onto the next. So that was very hard to learn. But at Blue Sky Studios, there were a lot of amazing animators that I could learn from, and so yeah, it was fun.